A pale fog rolls over the mountains of Egeria, West Virginia, swallowing the hollows whole. The roads here are nothing but thin veins of gravel and mud, winding, silent, and half forgotten by the world beyond the ridge. Somewhere deep in that mist, in a small clapboard house patched with tin and memory, a boy named Larry Whittaker takes his first breath of mountain air. It's the 1950s, a time when radios hummed faintly from distant towns, but their voices never reached this valley. In this place, the world felt older, slower. The mornings began with the cry of roosters and ended with the hush of wind pushing through broken window panes. The Whittakers didn't have much, but what they did have, they held on to family, faith, and the quiet understanding that the world had turned its back on them long ago. Larry's hands were small, but his chores were not. He learned early how to stack wood, mend wire, and watch over his kin. His mother, kind but worn, spoke softly, her voice like an echo that didn't travel far. His father, a man of few words, carried the weight of generations that had lived and died in the same hollow. Poverty wasn't something they complained about, it was the air they breathed. There were whispers, the kind that rolled down the mountains with the fog, whispers about the family's bloodline, about how close the kin had become over the years, about the strange mix of loyalty and secrecy that bound them tighter than most could understand. But for Larry, this wasn't strange. It was home. It was his world. Every sound told a story: the creak of the porch, the dogs howling through the night, the river sighing against the stones. Here, silence was their language. When the wind carried voices from another hollow, Larry listened not to the words, but to what they didn't say. And in those unspoken spaces, he learned more about survival than any man from the outside ever could. In these hills, children grew up learning to listen not to the radio, but to the way the wind carried secrets between hollows. This story, Larry's story, ties directly to the haunting legacy we've already explored in our previous film on the Whittaker family. But tonight, we return not as strangers staring through a lens, but as witnesses to the boy who grew up beneath that shadow, the one who carried his family's silence on his shoulders and never once set it down. So, as we descend once again into the hollow that time forgot, take a breath, lean in close. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe some stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe and stay with us as we continue to uncover the dark heart of America's underbelly bloodline. The sun rarely broke through the hollows of Egeria, West Virginia, and when it did, it seemed hesitant, as though the light itself feared what it might find. Inside the Whittaker home, time moved differently. Days bled into nights, marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of survival. Larry Whittaker was never alone, but solitude was something he understood well. Around him lived his brothers and sisters, a small, tight web of kin who depended on one another with an unspoken understanding that no outsider could ever decode. They didn't talk much, they didn't have to. Their language was gesture, a nod, a look, a shared silence that said more than words ever could. His brother would grunt softly when dinner was ready. His sister might point toward the stove, her eyes saying, "Eat before it's cold." Even the family's dogs had learned the rhythm of their silence, barking only when strangers came down the dirt road that led to their door. Each sibling carried their own echo of the past. The older ones remembered when the family was still whole, when their parents were alive, and the weight of whispers hadn't yet fallen so heavy on their name. The younger ones, born into the hush, only knew the quiet as normal. It was all they'd ever known. They were bound not just by blood, but by the need to protect that blood, no matter how tainted others claimed it was. The outside world saw them as strange, even grotesque, but inside that weathered home, love took on a different shape. It wasn't spoken or soft. It was the act of staying, of sharing a meal, of shielding one another from the stares and the rumors that drifted down from the town like poison in the wind. There were times when the tension rose, when hunger gnawed and tempers flared. Poverty leaves bruises deeper than fists. Yet, even in those moments, they found ways to forgive without saying the words, because words weren't safe in that house. Words could break what silence kept together. And so, silence became their protection, their cage, their inheritance. In a family like the Whittakers, silence wasn't absence, it was devotion. It was how they said, "I love you," and how they survived the world that forgot them. This was Larry's world, one of loyalty and quiet suffering, of love measured not in language, but in endurance. The story of the Whittakers is not a tale of monsters, it's a testament to how far a family will go to hold itself together when the world calls them broken. As we journey deeper into their story, we'll see how silence can both protect and destroy, how it keeps secrets no one dares to speak. So before we descend any further into these Appalachian shadows, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe every forgotten family deserves to have their story told, subscribe and stay with us as we continue to uncover the haunting truth behind America's Underbelly bloodline. The road that ran past the Whittaker home was more rumor than map, a narrow trail of dust and gravel that wound through Egeria, West Virginia, and disappeared into the woods. To the family, it was the line between two worlds. Inside, the hollow was survival, the smell of coal smoke, the barking of dogs, the rhythm of chores and hunger. Beyond it lay something distant and unknowable, the outside world. For young Larry Whittaker, that boundary was marked by a window. He'd stand behind it, just tall enough to see the tops of cars as they crept by, headlights cutting through the fog like searchlights in a forgotten war. He'd watch them slow down, strangers staring, whispering, sometimes laughing before their engines carried them away. He never waved. He only watched. Windows were Larry's first teachers, the glass that showed him the world, but never let him touch it. The first time Larry went beyond that hollow, it was to school, a small building that smelled of chalk and judgment. The other children stared, their eyes lingering too long on his clothes, his quietness, his family name. A teacher asked where he lived, and when he answered, the room fell silent. The whispers started, then soft, but sharp as broken glass. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He learned instead to read the world the same way he read his home, through silence, through gesture, through the subtle cruelties of those who thought they were better. That was the day Larry began to understand that blood could be both a bond and a curse. As years passed, the Whittakers became the ghost story people told, to feel safer in their own skin. Teenagers from town would drive up the dirt road at night just to catch a glimpse, their headlights sweeping across the sagging porch and cracked windows. They didn't see people, they saw spectacle. And Larry, standing behind that glass, saw everything. Each visit from outsiders chipped away at the thin wall between curiosity and cruelty. Their presence brought a different kind of cold, one that seeped into the bones of the family shame. But even as the world mocked them, Larry never looked away. He watched the cars fade down the hill until their taillights were swallowed by darkness. In a world that pointed and stared, he learned to survive by standing still. The Whittaker name began to spread beyond the mountains, whispered in towns, written in reports, filmed through lenses that never asked permission. The quiet hollow that raised him was no longer invisible. It was a story the world wanted to own. So as we step further into Larry's world, past the window, into the eyes of those who watched and judged, remember, every haunting begins with curiosity. Long before Larry Whittaker was born, before the cameras, the whispers, or the cruel jokes that would come to stain their name, there was just land. Raw, unforgiving Appalachian land that swallowed whole families and kept their secrets buried beneath the clay. The Whittakers had lived here for generations, carved into the hillsides of Egeria, West Virginia, like the roots of old trees, deep, tangled, and almost impossible to pull free. It started with poverty, not sin. A family too far up the mountain for the world to reach. No cars came this way, no doctors, no churches bold enough to stay. The railroad stopped miles before their hollow did. What came instead was isolation, the slow, suffocating kind that turns survival into inheritance. He didn't choose the name, but the name chose him. By the time Larry came into the world in the 1950s, his family's bloodline was already carrying the weight of generations who never left. Cousins became companions, siblings became lifelines. What outsiders would later call inbreeding had never been spoken of that way. Within these hills it was necessity, not choice. When the nearest neighbor is kin, and the next town feels like another planet, love and lineage blur in ways the world can't understand. Larry grew up hearing the echoes of those before him, names carved on unmarked stones in forgotten family plots. Men who died in the mines, women who gave birth by lamplight, lives lived without witness, without judgment, until judgment came years later in the form of flashing cameras and curious strangers. But to Larry, those ghosts weren't shame, they were protection. His last name was both shield and curse, something he carried with pride even as it weighed him down. He worked, he survived, he stayed. Because leaving meant abandoning everything his ancestors had built, no matter how broken it looked to outsiders. The Whittaker story, like so many Appalachian stories, isn't one of corruption, it's one of containment. Generational poverty, geographic isolation, and the slow decay of opportunity formed a trap no one saw as a trap until it was too late. And Larry, quiet and kind, stood at the edge of that lineage, the last son of a bloodline the world would come to judge without ever understanding. Sometimes the chains we inherit aren't made of iron, they're made of names. This is the Whittaker's legacy isn't about scandal. It's about the burden of identity, the quiet cost of being born into a story already written by others. And as we trace Larry's steps deeper into that family history, we begin to see that survival, in these mountains, was never simple and never without consequence. By the time Larry Whittaker was a grown man, the hollow had grown quieter, but the silence carried weight. The roads that led to Egeria, West Virginia, were still the same narrow veins of mud and memory, winding toward a home that most of the world had long since forgotten. Yet for Larry, that forgotten place was his duty, his burden, his blood. He rose with the sun, not because he wanted to, but because survival didn't wait for permission. The morning smelled of coal, smoke, and damp wood. His hands, cracked and calloused, knew the feel of rust better than rest. He fixed what could be fixed, patched what couldn't, and scavenged the rest. Old bicycles, broken appliances, scrap metal to Larry. These weren't junk. They were pieces of possibility. The hollow had taught him that nothing was useless if it could be made to last another day. He didn't have much, but he never let his family go hungry. The Whittakers didn't live by money. They lived by loyalty, the quiet, stubborn kind that doesn't ask for thanks. Larry's work wasn't about pride. It was about keeping the fire burning and the roof from caving in. Every swing of the hammer was a promise. We will survive. Outsiders saw only what they wanted, the unwashed clothes, the broken fences, the strangeness that made them a spectacle. They never saw the tenderness in Larry's care for his kin, how he carried food home first for his siblings before himself, how he would fix a door not because it was broken, but because it made his sister smile. There was a dignity in his silence. In a world that mocked his family's name, Larry's answer was work, constant, humble work. He didn't argue, didn't defend. He simply did. Because in these Appalachian hills, survival wasn't about fighting the world. It was about enduring it. Every scar on his hands was a story of sacrifice. Every nail he drove into the warped boards of that weathered home was an act of devotion. He carried the shame that others placed upon his family, but he carried it with strength, the kind that doesn't break, only bends with time. Work was his prayer. Sweat was his forgiveness. To the world, the Whittakers became a headline, a curiosity for cameras and conversation. But to Larry, they were still just family. Blood thicker than judgment, bound tighter than the chains of poverty that tried to crush them. So, as we walk alongside Larry through the rust and the ruin of his days, remember, dignity doesn't always wear clean clothes. Sometimes, it looks like a man with cracked hands, patching a roof no one else would stand beneath. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, it comes from loss. In the hollow where the Whittakers lived, silence was their oldest companion. But when death came, it changed its tone. It became heavier, like a weight pressing against the air itself. The winters in Egeria, West Virginia, were cruel that year, the kind that froze the wells and split the wood. Larry Whittaker, no longer the curious boy at the window, had become the man who buried the people he loved with his own hands. The first grave was for his father, a quiet man who had held the family together like the beams of that weathered old house. When he passed, something in the home bent, just slightly. Not enough to break, but enough for everyone to feel it. His mother followed soon after. Her voice, once the only soft thing in the hollow, faded into memory, leaving behind the smell of wood smoke and the creak of her old rocking chair. Some nights, Larry swore he could still hear it. Back and forth, a reminder of what once was. The Whittaker house grew quieter after that. His siblings spoke even less. Meals were eaten without words, their eyes downcast, their grief too deep for sound. In the hills, sorrow doesn't cry, it lingers. It hangs on the walls, in the dust, in the echoes of footsteps that no longer fall. Larry carried that pain the way mountain men carry their tools, heavy, necessary, and close to the heart. There were no funerals, no long speeches, no tears that others could see. Just shovels in the dirt, and a silence that stretched longer than the road leading out of Egeria. Some families mourn in words, others in whispers. The Whittakers mourned in silence. But silence can be cruel. It doesn't heal. It hides. Each death carved a deeper hollow in Larry's spirit, a loneliness that even the barking dogs and the laughter of neighbors' children couldn't fill. He'd sit on the porch, some evenings, staring into the trees, listening for voices that weren't coming back. The world beyond the hills didn't notice their grief. To outsiders, the Whittakers were still a story, strange, pitied, misunderstood. But behind that curtain of ridicule lived real loss, real love, real pain that words could never express. Grief doesn't always sound like crying. Sometimes it sounds like nothing at all. And so, the hollow stayed quiet, holding its dead and its secrets close. Larry went on working, caring, surviving, but the ghosts of those he buried never truly left. They lived in the house, in the air, in the sound of that rocking chair creaking through the night. So before we turn the page on this part of Larry's life, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe that behind every silence lies a story worth remembering, subscribe and stay with us as we continue to unravel the haunting legacy of America's Underbelly bloodline. It began quietly, the way storms do. One day, a truck rolled down that dirt road in Egeria, West Virginia, a road that had only ever known the sound of dogs barking and gravel cracking under old boots. But this time, it wasn't neighbors coming by for help, or kin bringing food. It was men from the outside, journalists, photographers, and later, documentarians. They carried cameras instead of kindness, microphones instead of meals. For Larry Whittaker, it was like seeing ghosts made of glass and metal, strange faces that smiled too wide, asking questions he didn't know how to answer. He wasn't used to being looked at like that, not as a man, not as a brother, but as a curiosity. They came with cameras. He only saw questions in their eyes. The visitors said they wanted to tell the family's story. They called it fascination, but it felt like something colder, like the old mockery dressed up as sympathy. Their lenses captured everything: the cracked paint, the sagging porch, the faces of a family who had never asked to be known. And when those images left the hollow, the world began to whisper again, louder this time, from millions of miles away. People watched from glowing screens, laughing, gawking, pitying. They didn't see Larry's quiet decency, or his lifelong labor to keep his family alive. They saw only what they'd been told to see: a spectacle. The Whittakers became the latest headline in a long tradition of Appalachian exploitation, another story twisted by distance and misunderstanding. Outsiders had been climbing these hills for decades, chasing tales of inbreeding, poverty, and darkness, but rarely staying long enough to understand the why. Larry didn't hate them for it. Confusion, maybe. Embarrassment, yes. But not hate. Because hate requires words, and the Whittakers had never relied on those. Their silence was their shield, a final line of defense against a world that spoke too loudly and listened too little. When the cameras left, the hollow didn't feel the same. The dogs barked more. The quiet felt watched. Even the trees seemed to lean in, holding the echoes of voices that didn't belong there. For the first time, Larry understood what it meant to be seen, and how being seen could feel like being stripped bare. Fame, the wind seemed to whisper, isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's a wound. In the years that followed, the world's fascination with the Whittakers only grew. But Larry remained steady, working, surviving, enduring, as though his silence could still protect what was sacred. Maybe it did. So as we turn our gaze upon this story, remember, not every lens tells the truth. Some distort. Some consume. The hollow wakes slow in the morning, the fog rising like old breath over the ridges, the faint rattle of tin from a loose roof, and the soft bark of a dog breaking the stillness. Down one narrow road, past rusted mailboxes and half-fallen fences, there stands a house that's been called many things strange, cursed, even God-forsaken. But inside, at its quiet center, lives a man named Larry Whittaker. To the world, the Whittaker name has become a whispered legend. Folks speak it with a mix of pity and fascination, shaking their heads as if the syllables themselves carry a kind of burden. But to Larry, that name isn't a headline or a rumor. It's his family, his blood, his story. He's not the loud one. Never was. Larry moves through the world softly, a man of nods, of small gestures, of hands that still remember work and worry. He picks up bottles along the roadside, helps the neighbors when they'll let him, and tends to what remains of the home that's seen too much sorrow. His face carries the years like rings in a tree, each line carved by loss, by loyalty, by love that outlasted mockery. Outsiders drive by, sometimes cameras in hand, curiosity in their eyes. Some stay long enough to snap a photo, others just slow down to stare. But Larry never raises his voice. He never curses or runs them off. He just nods, that quiet, patient nod, the same way a man might bow his head in church, half in prayer, half in resignation. He's the still heart, one neighbor once said, of a family the world never tried to understand. And maybe that's the truth. Because while the name Whittaker became a spectacle to most, to Larry it meant endurance. It meant that even when the world turned cruel, he would keep feeding his kin, keep fixing what could still be fixed, and keep the door open for those who truly came in peace. There's a sacred kind of dignity in that, the kind that doesn't shout or defend itself, but simply is. Even in the weight of a name that the world mocked, Larry found grace. Even in silence, he spoke volumes. So tonight, as you listen to the echoes of this story, a man who carried both his family and their legacy with quiet strength, ask yourself this: how heavy is the name you carry? There's a cracked mirror that hangs in the Whittaker house, its glass clouded, its frame warped with time. No one remembers when it was first hung, or by whose hands. But every now and then, when the morning light slips through the dusty window just right, it catches Larry's face in its fractured reflection. He doesn't look away anymore. Years ago, he might have turned his head ashamed of what the world said his family was. Inbred, backward, less than human. But now, in the soft quiet of age, he studies that reflection with a kind of peace. Because the mirror, for all its cracks, still shows something real. A man who endured. Outsiders saw strangeness, but Larry saw love. They saw poverty. He saw persistence. And in the eyes staring back at him, blue, tired, and still gentle, he finds traces of everyone he's lost. His mother's patience, his father's silence, the laughter of siblings that once filled the house before time took them away, one by one. There's no vanity in this moment, no sadness even, just acceptance, the kind that grows from years of being misunderstood. Larry knows now that the mirror doesn't lie, but it also doesn't judge. It reflects the truth of what a person has carried, the storms they've survived, the burdens they've borne without ever asking for pity. In the quiet of that room, the sound of an old clock ticking like a heartbeat, he whispers something low. Maybe it's a prayer. Maybe it's just gratitude that despite everything, he's still here. The mirror doesn't lie, the voiceover says, but it forgives. And that forgiveness isn't for the world, it's for himself. Because when you grow up, being told what you are, it takes a lifetime to remember who you were meant to be. So tonight, as we stand with Larry in front of that cracked mirror, seeing not the deformity the world tried to define, but the soul behind it, ask yourself this: when you look in your own reflection, what truths are you finally ready to forgive? The hills of Egeria, West Virginia, never forget. The fog rolls through the hollows like memory itself, soft, haunting, and eternal. And somewhere in that quiet mist, the echo of the Whittaker name still lingers, not as gossip, not as pity, but as something deeper, something human. Larry Whittaker's life wasn't measured by wealth or words, it was measured in endurance. Every sunrise that found him sitting on that same porch, every meal shared in silence, every act of care that went unseen by the outside world, it all built a legacy that couldn't be captured by cameras or commentary. It was the quiet dignity of survival. The Whittakers taught the world something it didn't expect to learn, that even in the harshest isolation, there is love. It might look different here. A brother fixing a roof with shaking hands, a sister sharing the last piece of bread, a family holding together not out of choice, but necessity. Yet that love was as real as the ridges that framed their home. They became symbols of misunderstanding. The nation watched, judged, and stared. But through all of it, Larry stood like a rooted tree in a storm. He didn't speak for attention, didn't defend his bloodline with anger. He simply lived, and in doing so, forced the world to see the people behind the prejudice. There's something almost biblical about it, the way shame was turned into witness, how a single family from the forgotten folds of Appalachia made the world look inward. The Whittakers didn't ask to be known, but by being themselves unfiltered, unbroken, they reminded us that every life, no matter how misunderstood, carries a story worth hearing. As the light fades across the hills and the holler falls back into its timeless hush, it feels like their story never truly ended. It's still out there, carried on the wind, whispered by the trees, woven into the soil of West Virginia. Some stories are whispered through blood. The Whittakers still echo in these hills. So tonight, as we close this chapter, I want to ask you, what legacy will your name leave behind? Tell me where you're watching from, and if you believe some stories are too human to fade, subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline, where forgotten names still have a voice.